Hello. So I'm doing a video here about critical race theory. Um, I'm not an expert in this, but it's very much because I'm not an expert in it that I'm doing a video on it. Now, the reason why I'm doing a video on the book that I've read about it, called Critical Race Theory and Introduction by Delgado and Stefan, um, is because there was a recent election in Virginia for the governor's seat. And this became a focus on the whole, at least as far as the media was concerned, on the whole election. Whether or not what it is, whether or not it was being taught in schools, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, the one thing that in all the media, and I try not to watch too much media because it can get you down, and probably most of it's nonsense anyway, is never actually explain what it is in great detail. And it's just a bunch of people talking past one another. They don't really, not really informing you, which is the news's primary job. So I thought at least I could educate myself and talk about it. So the book kind of goes into this. I'm not going to go into every detail on this, or otherwise you might as well read the book yourself. But essentially, CRT and its movement is basically a bunch of activists and legal scholars who are basically trying to put civil rights issues in a broader perspective with economics, history, a lot of sociological concepts, which on the surface of things doesn't seem that bad. Obviously, every group, every person exists in time, so they're a part of history. And because history seems to be deterministic, is that what happened yesterday affects what happens today. And there are sociological things going on as well. Okay, that's not bad. But now you're getting into the area of feelings and consciousness. You're getting very abstract, and you're assuming that that matters. And so one of the differences between CRT people is that they differ greatly from civil rights era people, where civil rights people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. focused on incrementalism, trying to get blacks, in his particular case, um, into society, getting them all the rights and privileges of every other citizen. Um, and then, which is something that I think most people agree with. Um, but CRT wants to go way beyond that. And they basically say we question the foundation of liberal order. So legal reasoning, they question that. Enlightenment values, rationalism, neutral principles of constitutional law, they're all calling this into question. So this is sort of where they start losing people. And I think the more people talk about this, the more they might lose people. So perhaps they were shrouding this in a little bit of a mystery in the public eye because most people would just not sign on to it. And one of the defining characteristics is that it contains an activist dimension. So the thing is that if you are studying this in a course, so CRT requires that the student or the scholar not only learns about the issues and legal theories, has to participate in an activist component for it. So that's sort of, if they are being taught in public schools, then they are pretty much being indoctrinated into activism, which seems to be a very scary thing, especially if your children are being indoctrinated. It sounds like they're being brainwashed. And so one of the things, so the main founder of this is a guy named Derek Bell, and I'll get into him a little bit later, who basically thought that Brown versus the School Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, which was a foundational sort of brought down the whole separate but equal idea in American legalism, was a bad idea. He thought that separate equal was probably a better idea because he didn't think that black people would want to or could integrate into white society or sort of the larger American society. So this guy is a segregationalist. So the founder of critical race theory did not think that integration was a good idea, and called for resegregation of most facets of American life. So this is the guy you're dealing with. This guy does not agree that these kids in Virginia at this time right here should even be in the same classroom as one another. And most of the people who are pushing hard for this do not want them to be in the same classroom. And that to me was shocking. I did not expect to see that. So anyway, I was going to talk, basically, I'll go through the basic tenets of critical race theory, that racism is ordinary. So this is just the normal, everyone's racist all the time. It's just racism just dripping off the wall. I mean, so that's kind of crazy. If that's the way you see the world, I mean, that's the way you see war. If you think that racism is everywhere, obviously you want to be away from it. So segregation, if you think racism is everywhere, is going to be a good thing. So this ordinariness basically says racism is hard to cure or even to address, and that colorblindness, the idea that when you look at somebody, you don't really take race into account of the way you behave towards them, really only solves the most blatant problems, that you have to sort of dig deeper than that. That's where that activist component kicks in, is that you have to be actively fighting racism in order to be a CRT follower. And that there's also this idea of interest conversion. This is basically, a lot of this stuff is borrowing from Marx, like wholesale. I mean, this is basically race Marxism as far as I'm concerned. That this interest conversion says that racism advances the interests of white elites, and essentially the working class whites have hitched their wagon to the white elites. So in the case of sort of class Marxism, you have the classes sort of binding together. So you'll have the proletariat binding together to form some sort of political bloc. And then you'll have the other classes like the bourgeoisie or the capitalists binding together to fight. Basically they're just lining up to have a big battle. And in this case, Derek Bell, as well as many CRT people, think that the races are just sort of sticking together as if there's some kind of team, some kind of connection between people of the same color instinctively. And I just don't see the evidence for that. But when you make all your proof as assertion, then you can basically assert anything to be true. There's also this social construction thesis that basically race is a product of social thought as well as relations, and that race doesn't really have any component that sort of matters other than socially. So obviously in biology and genetics, that it doesn't really, the color of your skin or sort of how your hair is or the color of your eyes, that doesn't really matter as much as far as race is concerned. That's a sort of socially evolved category, and it seems to be fairly arbitrary. And yet they still focus on it. So basically, there's another. The number 4 on this list is differential racialization. So the dominant society racializes different minorities at different times according to the needs of their needs, the elites' needs. And so it's a very conspiratorial view of things, that essentially at various points in American history, the claim is that the white elites will include people into who is considered white as long as it suits their needs, and then they will cast them out as non-white. So in the early days of American history, usually only the white English, sort of anyone from the British Isles, not everyone from the British Isles. The Irish were not considered white. Germans were considered white, and it was a matter of convenience. Mind you, this wasn't legal. It was more about there was no legal aspect to regarding color. There was a little circuitous route to exclude people into who was white and therefore who was able to vote. Um, um, and so basically, there's this push and pull of like we'll use you as it suits us, all the different races, and so who's considered white or acceptable to white people. It's There is an element of truth in that, but I think they're overplaying their hand because it kind of fits their need to make everything about race. And the last thing is that there's this unique voice of color. And so this is one aspect of critical race theory and progressive politics I find really creepy, is voices, experiences, narratives. And you will see this just loaded throughout the whole text, is that there's a focus on experience. How are you feeling? What did you go through? And as we all know, that experience is very subjective. Now, if you are the type of person to see monsters in your closet, then you will, any creak on the floor, any little flash of light on the wall will be that monster trying to come and get you. While it could have been a cat running around the house, or it could have been, any number of things, a light, playing off of the leaves, or a car, car's headlights going around. It really does seem to me that they want to see monsters everywhere, and telling these stories, believing these people's anyone's experience, it just seems a bit. There was this book written by Rudyard Kipling called Just So Stories, and the idea of a just so story is that it has to be told just so for it to have its effect. And I think these were stories that he read to his kid, but if you look at it from a different angle, the whole story falls apart. There's a load. I mean, I could go through a lot of these things, but essentially it's a lot of repeating. That essentially that CRT proponents, one, they're unhealthily obsessed with race. They see it everywhere, and it makes sense to me. Now, this is just me. It makes sense that they hate anybody who doesn't see this, because if you're obsessed with a certain type of music, like I like heavy metal and jazz, right? If I just don't want to hear any other type of music and you play country music, then I'm going to be very upset. Why aren't you playing heavy metal? Why aren't you playing jazz? And obviously, I don't have that unhealthy reaction. But if you want to impose your view on the world so badly, as these guys do, and then you see somebody not doing the thing that you want them to do, you're going to have a severe reaction to it. And it's very unhealthy. It's a very unhealthy obsession over race. Now, the thing is that it does tend to think, and this is true with a lot of these early people like Derek Bell, the very fact that the guy was a segregationist, the founder of this segregationalist, says like very clearly that he does not, or he's been dead for a few years now, but he did not want to have the world as it is. Obviously, so many of us don't like the world as it is, um, especially today. But just to change everything up because you have this sort of, it's the thing is, like, if you're a fringe person, you should probably know that you're on the edges of society. Sociology has this concept of deviance. And it doesn't mean like you're a pervert or anything. It means basically you're not, in some aspects of your life, you're not a part of the mainstream culture. These might be punks. These might be, I don't know, swingers. These, if you start talking about your deviation from normal society, you're going to alienate a lot of people in discussion. And the thing is that these sort of people can't accept the fact that most people in the world just don't agree with their worldview. Uh, and it does seem like there's an element of we're going to play games with words here. And I've noticed that a lot with Marxists do this a lot, where they will take an old word and they will totally warp it. And so whatever's going on the inside, when they say that, they're talking about their new version of this. And the rest of us are sort of left. It seems like we're having a conversation, but we're obviously not talking about the same thing. The example of this is racism. This word has been warped. It used to be to treat somebody like crap because of their race. Obviously, you would have a hatred for that race. So if you don't like people of a certain color, treat them like crap. That's an example of racism. It's fairly obvious to most normal people. What they've done is they've gone ahead and twisted the word into being some sort of something to do with power. It never had anything to do with power. You invented that. You just came up with a load of crap, spun it around, and then invented a new word. But you gave it an old word that everybody thinks has another meaning. And then you start educating people. And this is the whole activist part, is that they have to go out and educate people. And this is something I'll get into another video by a guy named Saul Alinsky, who basically sees that the only problem is, if you want to sort of enact your social policies, whether it's a full-scale revolution or if it's just, getting, police on your block or something like that, then, there's certain rules that you'll have to follow in order to get momentum in your movement. But this warping of language does seem to do that. And again, it's just not a very healthy way of viewing the world. So one of the other things, there's another thing in here that I kind of want to touch on because it's quite important, is this idea of legal storytelling and narrative analysis. Now, the thing is that we've all seen a movie. There was a movie called, it was a French movie. I forget the English name for it. It was called À la folie, pas du tout. And the French have a sort of game that they would play as children. Now, in English, we'd take a flower and you take the petals and he loves me not. He loves me not. And whatever you end up, he loves me, right? And they would have 3 or 4 of them. I forget the name of it. Where they would say à la folie, he loves me à la folie, to madness, or pas du tout, like not at all. But there's something in the myth, and you just kind of go there and, oh, he loves me a little. So, and in this movie, it was with the woman who played Amélie Poulain in the movie Amélie, and she, you see, the movie is actually 2 movies. It's back-to-back movies where the woman, she falls in love with this professor. It's been many years since I've seen this. She falls in love with this professor, and have this sort of whirlwind romance. And then at the end, it sort of falls apart. and I think she goes crazy. But as I say, it's been many years. The second movie, or sort of maybe there's the first hour where that's the movie, and then the second hour is you see it from the professor's um, perspective, and someone who never actually talks to him, she's obsessed with him unhealthfully, and she gets very dangerous with him, and it shows you that your perspective on things really does matter, to the way you're telling the story. But often you need another perspective just to say, hey, wait a minute, you're not just, this wasn't a whirlwind romance. You're fucking nuts. And I think the thing is that these legal storytelling, it's like I said, it's a just so story that if you tell a story in a certain way, oh, he was this downtrodden kid, his mother was never around, his dad took off, what other choice did he have in life? Now, obviously, there is that deterministic factor. If your mom doesn't marry your father doesn't give a damn about his kids, uh, the odds aren't good for that kid to have a thriving life. On the other hand, there's nothing that necessarily condemns him to a life of crime. But there needs to be an intervening factor in there, like a father figure. And so you would hope that maybe the grandfather, the uncle, or even a female figure who kind of acts as this sort of avuncular force in the guy's life, steers him on the right path. But every choice that kid makes, especially after the age of maybe 10, Catholics will often point to the age of reason being around 7 or 8, where you are morally culpable for almost everything you do. And in the law, I don't know, legally you're 18. When you're 18, you're an adult, but often they try kids who are minors as adults. Presumably that you know what you're doing and you should be tried as an adult, which means that the consequences are usually more dire if you're convicted. But the thing is that somewhere along the line, you have a choice to do something bad, to commit a crime. And if you tell these stories as if you're the victim and you're just a pawn in this game, or you're just like a little leaf blowing in the wind, then it's not your fault. And that's a narrative that your defense attorney would tell the jury, while the prosecutor would tell a different story. And so you need to have those two conflicting stories to maybe, to get a more well-rounded view of things. And so this idea of using experience is like what it's like to be. Now, it is interesting to find out what it's like to be on the business end of racism, business end of discrimination. I think it is useful to find out, if anything, that what the consequences of discrimination and racism are. But it should not be a determining factor about policy. This is more of like, hey, wait a minute. Really? I didn't know that I was really stepping on people's toes and treating everybody like crap. I didn't think about the consequences of my actions from the point of the view of the racist. That it's a way of building empathy. That, oh, wait, how would you like to be on the business end of racism? It is useful in that aspect, but to get somebody out of going to prison for committing real crimes should not depend on the story that these CRT theorists are painting, or what your lawyer is trying to basically do his best to get you off, or at least lessen the sentence. And to me, it's not a very good way of looking at society. There's one more thing that I have to mention is this idea of intersectionality. Now they go in through this. This is something that they actually kind of defer to another part, another spin off of this is this idea of intersectionality that essentially um, it's not enough to tell the story of black people because maybe if you have this dichotomy of white people are oppressing black people, then all of these black people are sort of generic in their being oppressed. But if you also take the dynamic that men are oppressing women, and there's another aspect of there's another dimension to this. So maybe perhaps that the black woman is more um, uh, oppressed than a black man. And then you could even add this sexual dimension. There's n number of dimensions in this whole equation here, where you could just add a different dimension. You could have a sexuality where this person is gay, a woman, black, and then you could add ableism where it's like, okay, now they're crippled. This person's crippled. Black, gay, what and there are so many different dimensions to the point where each one of these has a different story to tell, and eventually you just get to the very atomistic view of people, which is individualism, which is it's kind of ironic that they would even focus on this because if you follow it to its conclusion that everybody's different, everybody's going through. There's an old saying, um, "Be nice to everybody because everybody's going through a hard time. Even a rich person is having trouble in his or her life." Um, and as what's his name said, "Mo money, mo problems." Well, in a sense, it is true that you just get a new window into problems in life. You're never going to be rid of them. And essentially, I mean, like some of these things, I think you can go into more detail. I'm not going to really go too much into detail, but essentially, it starts splintering off when you mention intersectionality, and then people who don't belong to black or white sort of get left on the sidelines. Hey, what about us? Because you're thinking this black-white binary analysis, but we fit into this equation, and leaving us out of it will essentially will not give you a complete picture of things. It won't give us anything to do about our situation. To be honest with you, there's a point where it's a legal theory that might even have some justification of thinking about things as far as how to address public problems in society. On the other hand, everyone's an individual with individual choices. We all get dumped on in life. And I'm not saying that everything is your fault if things happen to you that are bad, but blaming whitey is not really the way to do things. And then, so this is, I mean, I've kind of summed it up in about half an hour. This was just the introduction. I'm sure you can go down this rabbit hole as far as you want. But ultimately, you have to be a true believer, and in the sense of like you have to. This is not something you slightly buy into. This is a very dichotomous way of thinking. It's very black and white. Sad to use that expression, but that's the expression. And you have to see the world in binaries of either you're for CRT or you're rapidly against it. And they have points in there, but they require that you buy all the points, that you buy completely into the system or their theory. And I don't buy into it. Even if you agreed on all the problem analysis, solutions that they propose of resegregation, of affirmative action, these are really, you're basically creating problems that were worse than the situation that you have it now. Making public schools segregated is a bad idea. I don't know why this is not being talked about. And another thing is like, okay, so you have this legal theory. This is a legal theory. In order to be mature about it, you're going to have to read a decent amount of literature on this. Now, I've only read one book. It was painful to read because their analysis, like I've gone through the last half an hour, analysis is very tenuous. It's a house of cards, and if you blow one little, the whole thing comes crashing down. The problem is that it's not really. You can get a more nuanced view of this if you read more text, and I plan to read more about this at some point. However, anything you teach a child, so obviously if it's being taught in Virginia public schools, it's being taught to 18-year-olds and under. So anything you teach to a child, even if you're not saying, here's critical race theory, we're going to be doing this, you can't really do that to an 8-year-old. So you have to build it into a lesson. And the thing is, how do you build this into a lesson? How do you get an 8-year-old to follow this? You can teach them about slavery. Now, some of the proponents say, well, I'm just trying to teach history. I learned about racism. I learned about the civil rights era. I learned about Jim Crow. I learned about slavery and the Civil War. And I was not taught critical race theory. So don't that is an absolute lie. Anybody who says that is just, they're blowing sunshine up your skirt. On the other hand, anybody who wants to push this are going to have to make it palatable to 8-year-olds, because 8-year-olds can only buy things if it's sort of given a sort of fun atmosphere. If you've ever had any experience teaching, children and adults learn better when things are fun, right? So you give them activities. Now, how are you going to base activities on critical race theory? You're ultimately what it's going to boil down. You have to boil things down to very sort of big blocks, very sort of. You can't do fine nuances with children. You have to be racism bad, slavery bad, right? I'm on board with that. You can teach them about history. You just take them down to a plantation, say, imagine working on here. It's middle of July. It's 100 degrees out. There's no air conditioning. You want a break? I get that. You want to teach a kid that? Maybe wait until they're like 11 or 12, because you don't want to make the kid cry. There's no point in making a child cry. I think you do have to teach this, just in the same way that the German students have to go to a concentration camp. So I've been to German concentration camps, to Buchenwald, as well as Dachau. They're creepy places, and the more you read about what happened in those places, it really just makes your skin crawl. People think I'm talking nonsense when I say this. It's like I can smell death in the air. You can just smell. There's something in the air that smells. Maybe it's in my mind, but I know other people who have agreed with me. Maybe it is a mass hypnosis. But anyway, the thing is that you can teach these people without getting involved in this arcane bullshit that largely does not stand up to scrutiny. I think saying that it's not being taught in schools, well, if it isn't being taught in schools, why are you against banning it? Because to be honest with you, on the face of this should not be taught in public schools. Whether or not it's being taught there is another issue. You can go out there, you can find, I'm sure it is. I don't know if it's full scale. I don't know if it's being presented as such. But this should not be taught to children. I don't even know if it should be taught to anyone. I'm not going to ban speech. I'm not a progressive. But I just don't see the point in teaching this to children. Teach him about slavery, teach him about the Civil War, teach him about Jim Crow and Martin Luther King. This stuff, it just points the finger as white bad. And if you think about the way children work, when you're 7 or 8 years old and your mother wants you to do something, she'll either do one or two things. She can do a few things, but effectively scare the crap out of you with threats about Santa Claus. Santa's not going to be coming to this house if you continue acting like that. So you basically have to invent this sort of thing where you can point to this and say, this is bad behavior. You're going to have consequences from this. So the thing is that you boil it down to either imaginary things, or you can say, this is bad, right? This is why, because God, the Ten Commandments or something like that. So you can use religion. But, sorry, I just heard somebody at my window. You can hear, so you get these ideas of the Ten Commandments. There's not a lot of nuance in there because it's thou shalt. And so children respond to absolute, not of, well, it wasn't very nice of you to do, this is more of threat. So they tend to think in that dichotomous view of the world, because their brains have to be sort of built for or developed for nuance, and that comes later. And you know this to be true from your own experience, that life for a child is fairly simple. When bad things happen, bad men do bad things, right? That's the only thing that, never mind the fact of why he did it, and maybe he feels regret about it. But you just have to learn in these very big blocks. So anyway, that's the point of this whole thing. Sorry I went on for so long, but I think people should read this book. Rent it. There is a PDF drifting out there in the ether if you don't want to pay money or be seen checking this book out at a library, but it is definitely available. I think even the proponents of this are trying to push this out there and handing out free literature, much the way a Christian would do to the Bible. So please read it. Don't take my word for it, as LeVar Burton would say. Just go and read it. All right. Thanks for watching. See you soon.